Not long ago, I visited Belgium, and I went to the city of Bastogne, which of course is a very important site related to the Battle of the Bulge of December 1944. And as I was touring that area, I found a German cemetery there, not far from Bastogne. There's a German cemetery pretty nicely kept, and a number of the grave markers, I would imagine, I think probably a majority, um, listed the soldier buried there as unknown. They said simply, an unknown soldier. And often for each marker, there would be two or three remains of German soldiers there. I was very surprised to see a cemetery for German soldiers in Belgium because, of course, Germany had invaded Belgium in 1940, had occupied Belgium. Um, Germans had, or Nazis had committed atrocities in Belgium. Not far from this German cemetery is another city called Malmedy, where a number of American soldiers were murdered by Nazis. And so it was very surprising to me to see in Belgium this German cemetery. I didn't know what to make of it. I still don't. But it does strike me as an act of grace. Sort of the way I interpret that cemetery is it's kind of an act of grace toward former enemies. I think a majority of the German soldiers in that cemetery are unknown. Um, their names aren't known. Their families were never notified or never could be notified. And maybe that's what motivates this, what I'm calling an act of grace. We have these remains of these young Germans, and we're going to bury them here in Belgium. It brought to mind a discussion I had recently with a Vietnam veteran. He was a Cobra pilot, and during one operation, a North Vietnamese bullet came through his windshield and took off the bottom part of his jaw, and he sustained a pretty serious injury, which then involved a lot of operations in the years after that. And he became aware during his operations in Vietnam that there were mass graves of North Vietnamese forces. After battles, so many North Vietnamese would be killed in battle. And the temperature is unbelievably high and the humidity is intense. And so, as a very practical matter, you want to bury these bodies very quickly. And so the hole is quickly dug out and the bodies go in, and you have this mass grave. But this veteran discovered as the years went by that for Vietnamese, the belief is that if we don't have remains that we can go to, if we don't have remains that we can visit and do the rituals over, then the spirit of that loved one is wandering in the forest. The spirit of that loved one is wandering in the jungle. And so there's this idea of, um, you know, many, many, many thousands of spirits of Vietnamese killed in that war, um, whose remains have never been identified. Those spirits are wandering the forest and wandering the jungles, and there are older Vietnamese who still believe this. And so this veteran who had been very much involved in the world of war, he had prosecuted combat against North Vietnamese forces, and North Vietnamese forces had prosecuted combat in his direction and had wounded him in the process. This veteran, many decades later now, goes back to Vietnam and participates in operations to help find these mass graves and to dig up the remains and then to do the work of trying to identify these remains. All of the attention put in this country on the missing in action. Of course, that flag flies under the American flag at every post office in the country, the POW MIA flag. And still there are more than 1,000 Americans whose remains are in Vietnam and they have not been found. And so there are still a lot of Americans who have loved ones that they know were lost in Vietnam, and perhaps they know the story how their loved one was lost, but they don't have any remains to go to. And the tremendous importance placed on that. Um, well, you know, the cultures of Vietnam, the cultures of the United States are very different. Um, but I think human beings have some things in common. And I think those people in Vietnam who experienced a number of missing that is so much greater than what's experienced in the United States, that leaves an enduring wound. And so this veteran goes back to help. Now, of course, a lot of Vietnam veterans would have absolutely no interest in that at all. They would find it strange, perhaps some would even think it kind of a betrayal to put out a hand like that to the former enemy. And I don't have any arguments with veterans who look at former enemies with very different perspectives, because people are different. They have different personalities, they have different experiences, they have different outlooks. And usually good arguments can be made for the different outlooks that people have when they reflect on former adversaries in war. But these two examples do raise that one possibility of decades after war extending a kind of grace to that former enemy. We look back and say, well, you know, the world is a messed up, complicated place, and war is probably the greatest manifestation of the kinds of disasters that human beings can create. And in these wars, it's overwhelmingly, at least in combat, it's overwhelmingly young men who are bearing the brunt of the world's insanity as we try to kill as many of them as possible, and they try to kill as many of us as possible. And decades go by, and maybe we can look at one another as former adversaries, and for all the differences, feel a kind of fellowship, the fellowship of the warrior, the fellowship of those who bore the burden of carrying the world's insanity through whatever that conflict was.